Africa is home to many of the world's fastest growing economies. Yet, despite this tremendous opportunity, the continent has been unable to benefit from this growth. And intra-African trade is simply not growing as fast as it should. According to the WTO, which is the World Trade Organization, intra-African trade represents only about 15% of the total African trade volume. So it appears that Africa has integrated faster with the rest of the world than it has with itself. As a result, Africa's market gets flooded with products imported from outside the continent. Now, to help solve this problem, African countries agreed in June of 2015 to establish the AfCFTA, which is the African Continental Free Trade Area. It is an agreement that is supposed to remove trade barriers and establish a single market across the continent. Now, according to the World Bank, the AfCFTA could create the largest free trade area in the world by connecting 54 countries and 1.3 billion people across Africa. It could also lift an additional 100 million people out of poverty. But is this really the case? Especially when you consider that the full integration of the African market is supposed to happen in the year 2063, which is 41 years from now. So, in this video, we will see if the AfCFTA is the tool that will finally allow Africans on the continent and in the diaspora to take back control of the continent's economic destiny and eventually rise to become the biggest economic force on the planet. Or is it just another initiative that is dead on arrival? And should we focus our efforts somewhere else if we want to transform African economies? So there you have it. Let's dive in and let's get to work. Hey family, welcome to AfriKili. As a reminder, the word AfriKili is a contraction of the words Africa and Akili, which means intelligence in the Swahili language, the most spoken language in Africa. So AfriKili stands for African Intelligence. If you've been reading our blog online at www.afrikili.com, you know that AfriKili advocates for the creation of a United States of Africa by focusing on three pillars: Pan-African history, business, and political action. And if you've not yet signed up for our blog, I invite you to do so by entering your email address on the website. So in today's video, we'll focus on Pan-African business. Specifically, we'll discuss if the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, or the AfCFTA, is the tool that will finally allow Africans on the continent and in the diaspora to take back control of the continent's economic destiny and eventually rise to become the biggest economic force on the planet. I mean, is it really important to have a full continental economic integration and turn Africa into a single unified market? I would say let's start by looking at the current situation when it comes to trade on the African continent. So just to clarify off the bat, when I say trade here, I'm specifically referring to the action of buying and selling goods and services. So one of the many paradoxes in Africa is that the continent is home to many of the fastest growing economies in the world. But yet, despite this tremendous opportunity, the continent has been unable to integrate its economies. And it's been unable to benefit from this growth. Because if you look at intra-African trade, which is trade between the different African countries, it is simply not growing as fast as it should. Now, according to the WTO, which is the World Trade Organization, intra-African trade represent only about 15% of the total African trade volume. Let's compare that with other region. Say North America. Well, intracontinental trade accounts for about 51% in North America. In Asia, it's about 49%, 22% in Latin America, and 69% among Western European countries. So when it comes to trade with the outside world, unfortunately, Africa still exports natural resources and raw materials while importing transformed products. Its market gets flooded with products imported from outside the continent. And as a result, the WTO reports that Africa's share in the global trade is less than 3%. But however, let's keep in mind that in many African countries, a big portion of the economies are informal and hard to measure. But still, let's look at this chart from the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, which visualizes the $94 trillion world economy as of December 2021. You will see that Africa represents about $2.5 trillion, which is about 2.6% of the world's economy. Now, you could look at it on the bright side and say that Africa has a huge potential to grow its exports outside the continent, but also grow its trade within the continent. Now, we should note that there are some RECs, which are regional economic communities, that have already been created in different African regions. And this was to reduce tariff and improve trade between the member states of those RECs. Some examples of these communities are the ECCAS, for example, which is the Economic Community of Central African States, which was established in December 1981. We have the UMA, which is the Arab Maghreb Union, which was established in 1989. We have the COMESA, which is the Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa, created in 1984. We have the ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States. We have the CENSAD, which is the Community of Saharan States, created in 1998. The CEMAC, Economic and Monetary Community of Central Africa. The EAC, very popular, the East African Community. We have the SADC, which is the Southern African Development Community, etc. So these regional communities are definitely commendable, right? But they're definitely not effective. Some of them, like the EAC, are very active, while others, like the UMA, have been totally unable to achieve any tangible progress due to various economic or political disagreements. Now, despite the existence of the RECs, the African market remains very fragmented, and cost of intra-African trade remains very, very high. You can look at this picture. It is just a mess. Now, you'll see here that every African nation is part of the African Union, which is the big circle englobing all countries. But at the same time, the same nations are part of so many different RECs that are overlapping with one another. And as I said, it is just a big mess. And as a result of this mess, Africa has integrated more with the rest of the world and much faster than it has with itself. So to help solve this massive trade imbalance and massive trade problem, member states of the OAU, which is the Organization of African Unity, agreed in 1991 on a roadmap for the creation of a common African market. So this was the 1991 Treaty of Abuja in Nigeria. During the meetings leading to the signature of that treaty, African nations agreed to work for the creation of free trade areas, custom unions, a single market, a central bank, a common currency. But it actually took 24 years for African nations to finally start acting on the Abuja Treaty. This was in June of 2015, when the member states of the AU, the African Union, agreed to formally establish the AfCFTA, which is the African Continental Free Trade Area. So as of now, January 2022, 37 of the 54 African Union member states have ratified the agreement, which means their countries are official members of the AfCFTA. So what exactly is this AfCFTA? Well, it is an agreement that aims to create a single market for goods and services in order to increase the intra-African trade and strengthen the economic integration of the continent. This agreement is supposed to remove trade barriers and make it easier for people to move across the African continent and trade goods. Now, according to the World Bank, the AfCFTA could create the largest free trade area in the world by connecting 54 countries and about 1.3 billion people across Africa. It could also lift an additional 100 million people out of extreme or moderate poverty. So, is the AfCFTA the tool that will finally allow Africans on the continent and in the diaspora to take back control of the economic destiny? Or is the FCA the tool that will put Africa on track to eventually become the biggest economic force on the planet? Well, one thing which I know for sure is that establishing a single market and eliminating trade barriers could create an economic powerhouse. Because, see, if you have a continental African market with 1.3 billion people right now and projected to go up to 2.5 billion people in the year 2050, this would be huge. And this would allow many businesses to scale significantly and become global leaders. Now, if you need a good example, you can look at some of the African entrepreneurs like Aliko Dangote, Ibrahim, or Masiyiwa, just to name a few. You know, they all became billionaires by implementing a Pan-African strategy and expanding their businesses in several African countries. Aliko Dangote, for example, he's the 64-year-old Nigerian business mogul. He's the chairman and CEO of the industrial conglomerate called the Dangote Group. He also happens to be the richest black person in the world, with an estimated net worth of about $13 billion. He initially made his fortune by trading commodities such as sugar, flour, before eventually becoming an industrialist. But his fortune grew exponentially as he expanded his business across several African countries, such as Benin, Ghana, Nigeria, Zambia, and Togo. So when it comes to the other entrepreneurs that I mentioned, Ibrahim, the 75-year-old billionaire from Sudan, he was the founder of the telecommunications company Celtel before selling it in 2005 for $3.4 billion. When he sold Celtel, the company was operating in 14 African countries and had over 24 million mobile phone subscribers. Today, he leads the Ibrahim Foundation that advocates to improve political governance across Africa. A final example of an entrepreneur here is Masiyiwa, who's a 60-year-old billionaire from Zimbabwe, who also happens to be a philanthropist. In the early 1990s, he founded the telecommunication company Econet Wireless in Zimbabwe before establishing operations and investing in more than 20 countries. So Masiyiwa is known globally for being appointed on the board of prominent international companies such as Netflix, Unilever, Bank of America. He's also a big philanthropist, supporting and educating more than 40,000 orphans across Africa, as well as providing scholarships for African students in America, in the UK, United Kingdom, and in China. So as we have seen from these three entrepreneurs I just mentioned, having access to millions of customers across different African countries has proved very beneficial. Now, let's be clear. I am certainly not implying that having a unified continental African market would automatically turn all entrepreneurs into billionaires or millionaires. That is definitely not what I'm saying. However, we should note that usually when a business has access to a large number of customers within the same market with the same rules, well, the more chances that business has to scale. Others might also say that, well, with the help of digital technology, businesses are no longer stopped by physical borders, right? And they can already access customers across several countries. That might be true in certain circumstances and for other continents that have highly developed internet infrastructure and distribution logistics. But that is not always the case for the African continent. Therefore, I believe that many African entrepreneurs could benefit tremendously from having access to a large continental market, and millions of people could be lifted out of poverty by having access to employment. Apart from individual entrepreneurs and businesses, I believe that the entire African continent would also benefit at a macro level from having a large single market. We can simply look at countries like the United States of America. Imagine if the 50 states within the USA were actually different independent countries. So for example, A business based in the country of, say, California, would not be able to sell to customers in the country of Texas without paying tariffs or facing additional costs, just to comply with the different business rules. So clearly, the United States would not have the large tax revenue base that it currently has in order to build the country to the power that it is today. So it definitely would not be the economic powerhouse that it is today. The same could be said of countries such as China, India, Russia, or even the European countries that decided to form a single European market under the EU, the European Union. They understood that having a large unified market would provide the foundation to gain great economic and political power. So in the same line of ideas, I believe that having a single African continental market could turn Africa into the leading economic force on the planet. And it would benefit Africans both on the continent, in the diaspora, and frankly, the whole of humanity. However, there are two major problems that will prevent the AfCFTA from having its full desired impact on the African continent. The first problem is that African political leaders are saying that they want to implement the AfCFTA, but are really not truly committing to it. The second problem is that just like in the 1960s, African political leaders are afraid to eliminate their national borders and establish a true Pan-African Union. Now, let's look at this problem one by one. If we take the first problem, the lack of commitment from African political leaders, I already mentioned that the path towards the continental market began in 1991 with the Treaty of Abuja, and it took 24 years, all the way up to June 2015, for African political leaders within the AU, the African Union, to finally agree to establish the AfCFTA. And as of today, only 37 out of the 54 African nations have ratified the agreement. And that's not all. The biggest joke is that without the say of their population, African presidents and leaders have decided to push the implementation of the AfCFTA all the way out to the year 2063 as part of what they have called Agenda 2063. That is 41 years from now. This is a definition of pushing the can down the road and refusing to implement change. Now, most African leaders are not exactly young spring chicken. They know that many of them won't be alive or in office 41 years from now. So without the necessary political commitment, full integration will likely not happen during their tenure in office. They're essentially pushing the issue on the desk of future presidents and future governments. The second major obstacle that I see to the implementation of the AfCFTA is that African political leaders are still refusing to dilute some of their sovereignty for the establishment of a true Pan-African Union. They're still insisting on keeping the African borders that were drawn and imposed by colonizers during the Berlin Conference of 1884. And that was for the benefit of colonizing nations. This was the same problem that Kwame Nkrumah faced when he proposed the creation of a United States of Africa in the 1960s. Some president agreed with him that the best option was to create a big nation that would instantly become a superpower and would command respect when negotiating on the international stage. Unfortunately, many other presidents that had already tasted the luxuries of power sided against Kwame Nkrumah, and instead they opted for the creation of the OAU, which is the Organization of African Unity. And so they decided to continue leading the microstates that were drawn by the colonizers. I believe that this is the bigger problem that will prevent the full implementation of the AfCFTA, because it is actually creating competing incentives and frictions between national interest and Pan-African continental interest. All you have to do is listen to the speeches of the presidents who have ratified the AfCFTA as part of Agenda 2063. They usually justify their objectives as wanting to maximize the well-being of their national citizens as opposed to strengthening the entire African continent. So as long as their decisions on trade benefit them, they have no issues if they decimate other African countries or prevent them from developing. They see it as a zero-sum game, meaning that their country's gain is equivalent to other countries' losses and vice versa. As a matter of fact, some countries that have been able to put together a friendly business environment have already allowed foreign multinationals to set base on their territory and work closely with them to plunder and exploit their neighboring countries. So in this context, the AfCFTA, without a true Pan-African political integration, is not a welcome sight. It will only make the problem worse, and we cannot accept it. See, by deciding to create a single African market, when at the same time refusing to establishing a United States of Africa, African countries are actually shooting themselves in the foot. We should know that the allure of a large single market will attract even more multinationals on the continent, with the intent of flooding the markets with their goods and services, which is normal. But most local African economies are dominated by informal players that will not be able to compete with the powerful foreign multinationals. So by continuing to hide under the veil of national sovereignty, most political leaders will be free from the oversight of their peers at a continental level, and they will continue opening their nations to be exploited by the highest bidders. You'll have an increase in FDI, which is foreign direct investment, which will simply allow foreign multinationals to enter the AfCFTA space with enough resources to buy undemocratic governments and dominate African markets. In other words, keeping colonial borders will ensure that it will be business as usual. The status quo will certainly not allow Africa to become a prosperous economic powerhouse. So, what should we do on the African continent and in the diaspora if we want to solve this dilemma? Well, if we want the African continent to finally maximize its potential, if we want prosperity and resources to be efficiently allocated, if we want Africa to rise as a true global economic powerhouse, if we want Africa to be the motherland that we can all be proud of, then one thing must happen. And that thing is that we must include a true Pan-African political integration as part of the equation. We have to strengthen the foundation for collective sovereignty towards a federal United States of Africa. By having a system of political checks and balances across the continent at a continental level, we will ensure that the tide will rise and that all boats will rise across the African continent. A prosperous African continent would offer limitless opportunities for Africans on the continent and the entire diaspora. On the other hand, the status quo or business as usual will not get it done. You see, it is not by accident that people like Ibrahim, after making billions of dollars through business, decided to shift his focus to advocating and providing tools for the improvement of political governance across the entire African continent. He understood that without better governance across Africa, the continent will never maximize its economic and social potential. By continuing to stand individually, African countries that were the creation of colonizing nations will continue to be too weak to command respect on the international stage, and their resources will continue to be exploited. The excuse of sovereignty also provides the perfect cover for undemocratic governments to personally benefit from the plundering of their resources in those microstates, while their population do not have access to prosperity. You see, when you sit on a gold mine and your neighbors know it, two things have to happen. Either you become strong enough to protect your resources and trade them fairly, or you are too weak and you will be pushed over and exploited. Clearly, Africa is an unbelievable gold mine and such a treasure trove. And we should be mindful that most resources are finite, so they will not last forever. But still, I sometimes pause because for some reason that I still don't fully understand, throughout history, the African continent has been bestowed with so many resources that are essential for the world to function. Even today, in what we call the third revolution or the information age, if you take away Africa, you don't have the infrastructure or the receptors to scale technology. The same goes for EV electric vehicles with the storage batteries, etc. So it is time for a true Pan-African Union if we want to turn the economic fate of the continent. Now, when I say Pan-African Union, I do not only mean Africans on the continent. I mean Africans born inside the continent and outside the continent. Africans that relocated outside the continent after their birth, but also the entire diaspora. Because by bringing together talent from the entire African continent and the diaspora, we will ensure a level of competence that has never been seen in the history of the world. Let's not forget that the African diaspora is far-reaching and has acquired diverse skill sets in different regions of the world. This presents an unprecedented pool of talent that can contribute to raising Africa to unprecedented heights. Of course, we need the right set of circumstances. And I think that a united state of Africa would be the best way to achieve this goal. So there you have it. We have seen through this video that a single unified African market is a necessity, and the AfCFTA could certainly be a tool that can help achieve that goal. However, it faces serious challenges because of the lack of urgency and the lack of political commitment from African leaders. Therefore, a Pan-African political integration must also be part of the equation if we want to save the AfCFTA from being dead on arrival. I believe that the African continent has all the ingredients to turn it into a massive economic success story. As I also like to say, we are seeking a revolution in changes, so let's not kid ourselves here. But this revolution and the changes that we're seeking cannot be done by one person or one movement. It can only be done by collective effort, which is why AfriKili strongly advocates for working in laser-focused coalitions. We need to pool our resources, aggregate our efforts. So I am really asking you and humbly asking you to join the AfriKili movement, the grandiose dream of unity across the African world. Even if you are already part of another movement or leading one, I am asking you that we work in coalitions. If we get this right, our actions will echo for generations, and we will be known as the generation that finally put Africa back on track towards unity and prosperity towards the United States of Africa. Now, whether you were born on the African continent, born in the diaspora, relocated after your birth, or your ancestors were taken out of the continent hundreds of years ago, you are essential for this to work. So I humbly ask you again to join the cause. Join the AfriKili movement. Join the coalition. Join the fight for a United States of Africa. Thank you very much for your attention. And before closing, I would like to remind you to subscribe to our AfriKili YouTube channel, but also, very importantly, to sign up with your email on our blog online at www.afrikili.com. And finally, please like or follow our social media profiles on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Twitter. I really look forward to meeting you, joining with you in this journey towards a better Africa, a better world. Now, can we really raise Africa to become a true global economic powerhouse? Yes, we can. It will happen. I have this dream. So let's get to work. AfriKili, African intelligence to build a new Africa. Peace be with you.